we're seeing another technological capability now that is going to introduce new entrants into this space, whether it be another US company or the Chinese. I don't know. If I was at Microsoft, I would not be rest. This is not a time to rest on your laurels. And there's nothing, history teaches us, there's nothing that says that Microsoft, as of necessity, has to be the force that it is in 15 years' time. In fact, if anything, history teaches us that eventually the center tectonics plates shift and it's someone else who's on a different business model, different value proposition that gains traction.
Welcome to the Startup to Exit podcast, where we will bring you world-class entrepreneurs and VCs to share their hard-earned success stories and secrets. This podcast has been brought to you by TIE Seattle. TIE is a global nonprofit that focuses on fostering entrepreneurship. TIE Seattle offers a range of programs, including the Go Vertical Startup Creation Weekend, TIE Entrepreneur Institute, and the TIE Seattle Angel Network. We encourage you to become a TIE member so you can gain access to these great programs. To become a member, please visit www.seattle.tie.org.
Hello, everybody. Welcome to another episode of our podcast From Startup to Exit. I'm here with my co-host Shirish Nadkarni. My name is Gowri Shankar. We both serve on the board of TIE Seattle, which produces this podcast. First of all, we both want to thank you for all the support that you've given us over the last year, where we have brought this podcast to all of you, and I hope all of you have enjoyed all the content that we are bringing from our guest. We are launching a very special series. We are launching a series that is very close to both our hearts because we are both Seattleites. Microsoft just turned 50. And as a tribute to the company and the impact it's had on the world and our city, we are going to talk to some of the very early executives who shaped and grew the Microsoft brand to what it is today. I hope all of you enjoy it. We will be talking to many of them, and over the time, you will learn a lot of things about the early years of Microsoft. Thank you all, and hope you enjoy it.
Hi, everyone. I would like to welcome Paul Maritz for our Microsoft at 50 series of podcasts. Paul was one of the senior-most executives at Microsoft from 1986 to 2000. Paul became the executive vice president of the platform strategy group and developer group and was part of the 5-person executive management team. He was often said to be the third-ranking executive behind Bill Gates and Steve Ballmer, along with Mike Maples. He was responsible for essentially all of Microsoft's desktop and server software, including major initiatives such as the development of Windows 95, Windows NT, and the Internet Explorer. So welcome, Paul. Glad to have you here.
Good to be with you today.
Thank you. So, Paul, I understand you grew up in Rhodesia, now known as Zimbabwe, and went to school in South Africa after that. What was it like growing up in the apartheid era?
It was, in one level, a very normal existence, another level, a very strange existence. White people lived cheek by jowl with black people, but at the same time, there was a great divide between the two. And over time, that became more and more visible and obvious. I think a lot of people believed that eventually it was going to be unsustainable, and a lot of people feared that it would probably end in a very violent situation, which in some cases, like in the Bush War in Rhodesia, it did. But in South Africa, fortunately, thanks to remarkable leadership on both sides of the divide, that was avoided. So even though people tend to kind of see South Africa as having a lot of problems today compared to what it could have been, it's obviously in a much better situation. So it did, it certainly did impress upon me, the realization that luck plays a lot of a big factor in life. That the fact that I was born in one side of the divide and not the other side of the divide obviously had a huge impact on my subsequent life. And I think over the years in the various roles I had, people finally got sick of me saying to everyone and saying, that we should be very humble and thankful because for every one of us sitting in this room, there are probably hundreds or even thousands of people who are smarter than us, worked harder than us, but just for the, fortune, we're here and they're not. So I think all of us who were at Microsoft during the incredible journey from the mid '80s through today, that matter, have to realize that we were given the privilege to be part of something that occurs only a few times in history. So we should all be very cognizant of that.
Very well said. So you went to South Africa with your family for schooling, and then you worked in the UK for some number of years, and then ultimately ended up in the US. What made you decide to come to the US for work?
Well, I had left South Africa partly because of this fear about what the future held, and partly because I wanted to work in the computer industry. I was one of the first graduates of computer science in Southern Africa and in the world. I graduated in 1977. The computer science was relatively new then, but I knew I wanted to work in the computer industry as opposed to just using computers, and that meant having to leave Southern Africa. So I went first to the UK and started working for a company called Burroughs there. And if you can remember that name, you're dating yourself.
I remember that. Yeah, I remember that very well.
And while I was there, I had originally thought I'd follow an academic career, so I'd gone back to university and had an offer to become a junior lecturer in Scotland. But my boss at Burroughs had moved to Intel, and he persuaded me to come and join him in California at Intel. And I told my wife at the time, we'll always have the opportunity to come back to the UK, but probably this is our only opportunity to go to the US. So I went, and that again put me on a whole different path in life. So I spent 5 years working at Intel, which is very formative experience for me. Only afterwards I realized that how good a management team Intel had it in those days, in Andy Grove and Bob Noyce and Gordon Moore, and they obviously thought very deeply about what leadership and management meant. And actually, I brought many of those lessons to Microsoft later, some of which became somewhat controversial, things like ranking and rating, renting and rating.
Oh, I remember that. Yeah. I remember that.
But that all came from Intel to Microsoft. So it turns out that my kind of mentor, a guy by the name of Jim Harris, who had brought me to Intel, then went to work for Microsoft. He was the first head of OEM sales at Microsoft. And I nearly joined in 1983, but I had startup fever. I always wanted to do a startup, so I declined it, which I then subsequently rued because it meant I missed the initial IPO at Microsoft.
Right.
And in '86, I tried to do a startup on my own. And as Jim Alchin put it, when you can no longer afford the milk to go with the cornflakes, you have to be humble. So I put my tail between my legs and came back to Microsoft and took a job there in late 1986.
So was it because of your previous manager, or were you intrigued by the potential?
By then, as I said, I interviewed in 1983 and met Steve Ballmer and Bill Gates and Vijay Bashi and others. So I had connections there. Jim Harris was still at Microsoft. A lot of people don't remember him because he left fairly soon after 1986. But he's actually the origin of the eat your own dog food story.
Okay.
We can come back to. But so I joined in 1986, kind of with tail between my legs, and what they did is they said, okay, you can take over Xenix. People forget that Microsoft, before MS-DOS even, was the first commercial licensee of Unix from AT&T. In those days, AT&T was still under the consent decree with the government, and they were not allowed to go directly into the software business. So they had this asset called Unix that they wanted to try and market and they marketed it on a peculiarly strange licensing scheme. So I was given this 12-person group at Microsoft and told to do something with this business, which I think was like $1.5 million a year. But by that stage, Microsoft had already embarked on MS-DOS and signed the joint development agreement with IBM to do OS2. So this was always going to be a backwater, but that's what I was given. And so I eventually figured out a way of exploiting AT&T's licensing terms in such a way that they wrote their licenses as perpetual licenses. There was never any expiry. So when I figured out the loophole, there was no way out for them. So they eventually agreed to buy us out, in effect, and in return for a $15 per PC royalty. Anytime any form of Unix was sold on a PC, this is pre-Linux days, we would get $15. For years that brought in like $1 million or $1.5 million a year to us. And, I always felt good that whatever else had happened, I'd paid for my salary at Microsoft.
That's great.
But then, but it was clearly a backwater, and so I asked for something more ambitious. So I was given in the networking business to try and compete with Novell. Remember, in those days, it's 1987, 88.
Right. I remember actually at that time you were the general manager for LAN Manager. Is that right?
That's correct. So the product we formed was LAN Manager, which used OS2 on the server and the SMB networking stack, etc. But it was a tough road to hoe because Novell had 80% of the market,
right?
And that's actually the origin of eat your own dog food, because the phrase came from Jim Harris, who always used to lean back after their presentation and sort of say in his big booming voice to everyone assembled, "Yes, but will the dogs eat the dog food?" As the final test. So we had, because we were nowhere in the networking business. I sent an email to the group saying, "Look, we've got no customers. We're going to have to be our own beta test users. So Brian, and we're going to have to eat our own dog food," I said. So Brian Valentine set up a server called // dog food. That was the first test server in the group, and somehow things got on from there.
Right. So it took some time, but finally, Microsoft crushed Novell. What do you think was behind the success eventually of Windows and Windows Server compared to Novell?
Well, it was Windows NT. I mean, what killed Novell was finally the fact that Windows NT became a force on the server, and then there was the question was why have this other strange server that just serves files and print when you can have a general purpose server that does file and print and several other, and email and the rest of it.
Right.
So we didn't take major market share. We kind of won by changing the ground rules, changing the nature of the game. It's the same way that the applications group won against WordPerfect and Lotus 1-2-3, because they went to Windows and they changed the game. Until then, they could make no headway against WordPerfect and 1-2-3.
Right. Got it. So when I understand that you were given responsibility for the OS2 relationship with IBM, is that correct?
Yeah.
When did that happen?
That happened in, I want to say 1990, and maybe 89. It happened in 1989.
Yeah.
Steve had wanted to move to Steve was having to manage the A2. Steve Ballmer was having to manage the IBM relationship, which was becoming a real pain in the butt and time sink. So he handed it to me, and I was given OS2, and trying to figure out what could be done. In those days, it was a sort of article of faith that the reason that Microsoft existed was because of the relationship with IBM. In the late 80s, 87, 88, 89, we used to have these executive offsite retreats. And there was always, one of the topics was, what do we do if IBM divorces us? That was sort of the doomsday scenario. So the feeling was that we had to maintain the IBM relationship at all costs, but at the same time, OS2 had become this beast that was so overburdened and trying to serve so many goals that it was just clearly failing as a system. And at the same time, David Weiss and others had figured out how to extend Windows to handle larger address spaces, initially on the 286 and then on the 386. So there was this increased. Bill was getting very frustrated with the IBM, with OS2 in particular, and indirectly with the IBM relationship. But he didn't want to let go of it. But at the same time, he could taste and feel Windows that was much better suited to the 386 generation of PCs at that time. So there was this increasing tension. So I was given this, job of trying to make something out of this, and struggled at it valiantly for 9 months. I remember there's a time in my life when I used to get on a red-eye flight on Thursday night, fly to Boca Raton, get there at 9 o'clock in the morning, be in meetings with IBM, turn around and fly back, getting back to Seattle at midnight. I became a sort of lifetime American Airlines flyer because of that. But at the end of, and then we launched Windows 3.0. I think that was 1990, was it? I could be wrong here, a year or two off. But it started to succeed, which put even greater pressure.
Right. That is finally when Windows started taking off.
Yeah, Windows started taking off, and it became, the cognitive dissonance just got bigger and bigger as to why we were putting effort into these two directions. And our OS2 team internally at Microsoft became more and more demoralized because they were having to work with IBM. They felt they had one hand tied behind their back, while their colleagues at Windows were running riot. So eventually, I came to the conclusion it was unsustainable that sort of Microsoft and IBM had got themselves into a situation where, rather than getting the best out of both companies, we were getting the worst out of both companies. So I eventually said to Bill and Steve that unless something changes, I was just going to, untie my hand. I was going to stop working with IBM unilaterally. I don't think they really believed me, but I gave them a deadline in sort of 2 weeks or something, and the day came and went, and nothing changed. So I told the team to stop working with IBM. We just cut off all communication and stopped replying to emails, didn't do the joint build, etc. And of course, that caused the shit to hit the fan. So all of a sudden, there were urgent meetings going right up to Bill Gates and Jim Canavino, who was the IBM senior vice president on the other side, and it precipitated a lot of brinksmanship. And here I have to hand it to Bill. He people forget that IBM never paid a royalty on MS-DOS. The original deal on MS-DOS is they had a one-time fee. I think it was $50,000 or something, and after that they got MS-DOS for free. So eventually IBM came back and said, okay, we'll let you continue to market Windows if you give us Windows for free as well. So we can have both DOS and Windows for free. And Bill refused. He said, no, I'm not going to do that. And then they said, okay, and so IBM said, okay, in which case we're going to bury you. We're going to take OS2 and we're going to compete directly with you and take you out of business. So we had to decide, obviously, what to do. I had this investment in the OS2 team, and by then we'd also, Dave Cutler and his team had joined the companies. We decided what we would do is essentially walk away from OS2 and redirect all of our so-called advanced operating system efforts towards a Windows API. And we came up with a strategy of having a common 32-bit API that would sit on top of Windows 4.0 and on top of what became Windows NT.
Right.
And so I had two teams, the Windows 4 team under Brad Silverberg and the Windows NT team under Dave Cutler, and the two teams did just about everything they could to sabotage the other. it took everything I could just to maintain that common API. They managed to diverge on everything else, file systems, device driver models, whatever. But we did keep a common API between the two that enabled the apps group in particular not to have to choose between Windows 4.0 and Windows NT. I thought there would be a much faster transition to Windows NT. Ben Slivka, bless his soul, at the time told me that it would take 10 years. I didn't believe him. He was right. But eventually the transition did happen. And it enabled us, that strategy essentially enabled us to see off both OS2 on the one hand and Unix on the other. Because we had a fully modern, secure operating system in Windows NT, which Windows 4.0, despite all its success, was not. So it couldn't have carried us for the long term. But yeah, so that's basically and at some point, I think in 1992 or 93, Steve Ballmer went to become head of sales. He wanted to really take that over and juice the sales side. So that's when I inherited all of the system side, and it was myself and Mike Baples with the apps, and I with the systems side of things, and that was sort of the general configuration. We had a lot of other interesting things going on at the same time. There was the whole Microsoft SQL Server story. That actually goes back to OS2 because IBM had their strategy was to, on the one hand, have OS2 to be the common operating system that everybody, including Compaq, etc., would use, but they had their own proprietary OS2 extended edition. So this is going back to the late 80s, 88, 89. We were always very paranoid that IBM was going to screw us that way by promoting OS2, but then selling the extended edition. So we had to go and build our own extended edition, which required us to get a database and an SNA communications package. So we went to Bob Epstein at Sybase and persuaded him to give us essentially royalty-free access to this to the Sybase source code, so we could port it to OS2 and make that our offering to compete with IBM's DB2, which was the database in OS2 Extended Edition. And then we made the switch, obviously, towards Windows NT. So we were porting now towards Windows NT. And then in 1993 or so, there was this strange German company that we started to hear more and more about called SAP. I first encountered them over at DuPont, and I was amazed and said, never heard of this company before. But it was clear that they were starting to become important. So we approached them, and at that time, Microsoft's internal IT department was still running all of our accounting systems on an IBM AS400, believe it or not, using ACPAC, etc. And so we were trying to persuade them to move off that and to use Windows NT as a statement of eating our own dog food and using our own system, but we needed an accounting package that ran on top of Windows NT. So we approached myself and David Vaskovich approached SAP, met Hasse Plattner, and he agreed that he would port SAP R3 to what became SQL Server, provided we added row-level locking, which was a feature that Bob Epstein was dead against. He regarded it as evil. So we had to kind of diverge the code bases and add that feature, which was a key feature that Oracle had. And Hasse Plattner believed that somehow by working with Microsoft, his guys would learn how to do attractive user interfaces. I don't think he ever got paid off in that regard, but that's how we got, another way that we got SQL Server established as a serious database. And at the same time, we had Exchange, Microsoft Exchange, that had actually started with another database code that we had. Back in the late 80s, we started to do explicit recruiting outside of the U.S. because that time we were in the late 80s, we were trying to hire like mad. So the first time we went both to India and to Israel and recruited engineers there. And we recruited one engineer's name, I forget now, but he was a database guy, and we hired him, and he built this essentially dynamic schema database, a database where you could dynamically change the schema, and we didn't know what the hell to do with it. So we had this code base. So it was initially intended to be the server counterpart to Microsoft Access, because Access was client-based. So, but then somehow, I forget exactly how we decided to use it as the back-end database in our mail server, what became Microsoft Exchange, and that's where MAPI and all of those things come from. So, Microsoft was nothing if not prolific with various APIs. And
I remember there was actually a battle at that time between MAPI and what was called Vim from Lotus.
Yeah, exactly. It's amazing, actually, that Microsoft actually won that battle in the long run. And, Active Directory, which I think also uses some of that technology. Maybe I'm wrong, I can't remember. But anyway, Active Directory has emerged as one of Microsoft's, major enterprise assets. Most enterprises in the world are tied to Active Directory, whether they like it or not. And by the way, that's another fun thing to talk about is all the various names that we had. People don't remember. Active was one of the first attempts to create an identity beyond Windows. You remember ActiveX controls?
ActiveX,
Well, all the ActiveX things, and then we decided that was bad, so we then went to .NET, which is why you still have some .NETs around, and then there was a live, and there's still some lives around, etc., etc.
That's right. Got it. Excellent. I'll turn it over now to Gowri.
Paul, this is quite fascinating to hear the first, version, right? Arguably the first decade of Microsoft, I would say. But two things that emerged from your stories, right? One was that they really worked with other companies, Intel, Novell, IBM, SAP, whoever it is, right? Just to kind of move this along. Was that sort of by design, or was this core belief that somehow we got to keep expanding, but we can't build everything? Where does that culture come from to begin with? Because that, as a startup, you have this tendency to say, I'll go build everything because you can, is the first thing. But instead, seems like at that point, partnerships of some kind were important, and that was sensing the market. Where did that come from in the first decade of Microsoft?
I would say it came from two perspectives. One was, and you can give Bill Gates a lot of credit for this, he always believed in the power of a platform. And, a platform almost by definition is something that becomes valuable because so many other people use it. If you take actually MS-DOS as an original example, MS-DOS was only, 50 or 60 bytes of code. Somebody could almost recreate it, in a weekend. And people did. There were, people forget there was Digital Resources, Dr. DOS, was a compatible competitor to MS-DOS. And I think there were a couple of others as well. But people would always be willing to pay a royalty, however small, to Microsoft to quote unquote get the real thing. And the reason for that is they were afraid that something would break because it was this platform on which so many other applications, whether they were, TSRs, terminate and stay resident things, etc., were dependent. So if you can get a platform going, and if you're not too greedy on the prices that you charge for it, the cost of switching is just not worth it for someone else to go away. So there was always this belief that we needed to establish a platform and get as many third parties using certainly our system level components, operating system, networking, tools, databases, etc. It was less so on the application side deliberately because they are more end user oriented. So they had less of an incentive to do that. It comes with a huge cost because now you have a massive testing matrix. Before you can release anything, you've got to make sure that you're keeping things competitive. sorry, not competitive, compatible. And, for many years, there was these app hacks in Windows that would literally look at the exe being loaded and say, oh, yeah, this application expects the top of stack to be all zeros, so even though it has no reason, there's no requirement for that, we would have to then load zeros. Otherwise, this app would break, et cetera, et cetera. So, that was one aspect of the desire to work with third parties. The other key part is just as important was paranoia. You got to remember that right up until about 2000, it didn't appear to us that we were, destined to be there for all time. Certainly up until 1995, I would say that was very much the case. I mean, as I said earlier, we used to have these themes at executive off-strikes, which is, what's the doomsday scenario? Somebody else gets hold of the platform, then we're screwed. So right through 1995, there was a lot of focus on competition. Through 1995, there were still people confidently predicting that Unix was the future, that things would go that way. There was the whole risk movement. All of these things which, could have, if they'd gone that way, would have severely diminished Microsoft's assets. It was a belief that, we had to have a strong support from partners, otherwise, as a defense against the platform going elsewhere.
As we celebrate the 50 years, right, of Microsoft, was it ever occurred at that point that this would be the longevity? Was there any, hey, we're here forever?
No, hell no. We were all 30 years old. I mean, you've got to remember that if you go back to 2000 and rewind the clock 50 years, computers didn't exist. So we had, if you'd said to me in 1993 that 40 years on from now, 30 years on from now, from then, people would still be using Windows NT. I would have just, I just wouldn't have could occur to me that it even be the case, because there had been so many revolutions in the computer industry before that, from weird things to the IBM 360 generation, to the VAX VMS generation, to Unix, we just thought, we're
so in a recent,
10 years, great.
There's been a whole lot of articles and Bill Gates writing his latest book, right? I read somewhere that that he's more a Rockefeller than an Edison, right? He understood the business sense of things extremely well, that he could take the technical capability and combine it with business. Compared to, say, IBM or Kodak or Xerox, that all had significant technology and contributed to what we even use today, whether it's cameras or the original computers and so on and so forth. The relevancy of Microsoft is greater now than the last 50, right? I mean, they are the top one or two most valued company on the planet. And looks to me, and Bill Gates echoed it in a couple of days ago when he did this 50 years of Microsoft with Satya and Steve, that the next decade is the most relevant decade for Microsoft than the previous 5. So, did you see that in Bill, and did that shape it? And do you agree with his assessment that the next 10 is the most important 10 than the last 5?
Well, let me handle that one at a time, because you asked two questions there. One was he more Rockefeller than Edison? In general, I would say yes. I mean, what made him remarkable is he did have such a good sense of the industry and what was valuable and the power of the platform, etc. On the other hand, he is one of the most intelligent people you could ever meet, and it was truly remarkable in many ways because he combined three things. He combined that instinctive strategic insight about the structure of the industry. He combined extraordinary technical depth. He could go toe-to-toe to anyone all the way down to the bottom of the stack. And he was also, a great, I wouldn't say a great manager, but he was a good enough manager to know how to hold a team together. Because, great endeavors are never the product of a single person. They're always the product of an effective team. And, the thing that I value about Bill is, he could be a son of a bitch, but at the end of the day, he would listen to you. Sometimes you had to hit him with a 2x4 before you do that. But he was secure enough in his own person to be able to take that feedback. He didn't feel like he had to win the argument. So, many times I could have cheerfully killed him for the way he behaved in meetings. But at the end of the day, it was about the argument. It wasn't about him or the person. And, you very rarely find those three qualities in a person. So I think, he deserves to be remembered as one of the great figures in an industry, in the way that you see other great people who've had a huge impact on their industry. Switching to your other question, is the next 10 to 15 years, I think it is crucial for Microsoft. I think it's going to be very interesting to see how they fare in it, because we are seeing a true revolution has occurred, which is, for the first time, computer systems can, in some very real and meaningful way, understand natural language. And that is a huge step forward. If you'd asked me 10 years ago whether I thought that was going to happen, even in my lifetime, I might have said, I doubt it. But the fact that you can now have a interaction or even a discussion in a very meaningful sense with the computer system is a huge game changer. It means that, almost overnight, every computer interface in the world is now obsolete, because you don't have to. In some cases, it clearly makes sense to still use a mouse and a pointer and that, but a lot of other cases, particularly in these cases where it's more difficult to express, you can now express high-level goals, which you couldn't do before, and the system can meaningfully adapt to those high-level goals. And that is going to revolutionize computer systems without any question. Now, Microsoft's done a good job so far at positioning itself in that race, but there's nothing proprietary that they have about their technology. There are a lot of other people who have, the original insights here came from Google. With their famous, all you need is attention, and then the transformer architecture. And whatever you think of DeepSeek, it's showing that there is no monopoly on Microsoft's behalf, or even on the West's behalf, of this technology. And I think it's, Microsoft's still going to be around 10 to 15 years from now, but every time one of these major technological shifts occurs, it allows somebody else to be introduced into the equation. Microsoft got introduced in the equation really on the back of the microprocessor, which made CPU cycles become, by historical standards, free. So you could afford to waste CPU cycles on a graphical user interface. So you went to an old mainframe program and told him how many cycles were being wasted every time you moved your mouse. They would have held their head in horror. And then the internet happened, and that allowed Google and Amazon and that to become significant factors in the marketplace. So we're seeing another technological capability now that is going to introduce new entrants into this space, whether it be another U.S. company or the Chinese. I don't know, but if I was at Microsoft, I would not be rest. This is not a time to rest on your laurels. and there's nothing. History teaches us there's nothing that says that Microsoft, as of necessity, has to be the force that it is in 15 years' time. In fact, if anything, history teaches us that eventually the center, the tectonics plates shift, and it's someone else who's on a different business model, different.
So you touched on two things there. Let me just kind of unpack a bit, right? You started a career at Intel, and they clearly are struggling right now as a company at this point. It looks like somewhere along they missed something, and they sat on their laurels and built on it. At the same time, Microsoft also missed a few things. The browser, right? Early on, there was a mess. Mobile was a mess. Was there something in the leadership that Microsoft had that allowed them to overcome such large misses, while others, whether it's Intel, Netscape, you can go through this road of success, and it's filled with companies that are dead or gone, and only people with gray hairs like us can remember those names, that they're not even in existence, right? What was specific that just with three CEOs this company's had has allowed it to be the tech relevant company today? Whether they sit on their laurels or do something is irrelevant, but they got here itself seems like a shocker, because everything indicates that they should have been gone for the misses they've had.
Yeah, it is remarkable, and I think it's attributable to two things. One is just the strength of those assets that Windows and Office were, and even today, the majority of the profits are still coming from those two sources. So it gave Microsoft an enormous cash flow stream with which to invest, and they tried several investments, as you point out, like buying Nokia, etc., that didn't pay off. And I think so they had this very strong two cash cows in Windows and Office that gave them a strong cash stream. And then third time they succeeded, and I give that full credit there to Craig Mundy. Craig Mundy was the guy who went and did the deal with OpenAI and gave them billions of dollars in return for royalty-free access to everything that OpenAI does until such time as they reach AGI, which is what I think is giving Sam Altman, heartache today. But without that, Microsoft would not be relevant today, and we'd be having a very different conversation about Microsoft today. We'd be saying, "Wow, they missed the boat once again." But it is Craig who went out on the limb and persuaded the board and Steve and Bill and then Satya to basically put billions of dollars into allowing essentially the scale to happen at OpenAI. And OpenAI's fundamental breakthrough, they may argue with this, was not the algorithms, but was just simply the scale at which they applied it. Allowing them to go to models that had billions and billions of parameters, which is brute forced by essentially building out this enormous hardware back end that's enabled them to succeed. And but it's a strange relationship. I mean, it's debatable how stable the relationship with OpenAI will be, because you've got two different entities now that, at the end of the day, have different ownerships and different, economic incentives. So I don't know. I'm not privy to what's going on in either company, but it's
Right.
It's going to be interesting to see how that gets squared in the long run.
But at the if you go back, say 1995, the browser really came into being, and the adoption was that may not be at the rate as ChatGPT, but it was still at an incredible pace at the adoption, right? That Amazon, it literally went to IPO 4 years later, once the browser became ubiquitous. If you sort of use that as a parameter. At that time, you were building Internet Explorer. Did you think that you should just buy out Netscape? Because that seems like you could have done it. Barksdale was an old AT&T guy, and
we very early on we had an opportunity to do a deal with Andreessen, and I forget what they called it before they started calling it Netscape, and we kind of somewhat arrogantly said, "This is 50K bytes of code again. Can't we just write this in a weekend?" And we did actually license some code from one of their competitors. You'd have to ask Ben Slivka. He probably would know the history here. So we did license some code, which was the first incarnation of what became Internet Explorer. I argued very strenuously to the Department of Justice in the antitrust trials that this was a huge threat to us, that if the browser took off, new applications, it would become a new applications delivery platform, et cetera, et cetera. They didn't buy that argument. But in the final analysis, it actually did happen. We did manage to stave off Netscape competition by somewhat changing the game on them by essentially pushing on this, actually accelerating this capability of the browser to become a real platform by introducing things like the DOM. That was all Adam Bosworth's work that showed how you could really use JavaScript to really script the browser itself and get single page applications and all of those things going, which somewhat wrong-footed Netscape. And so Internet Explorer 3 was the one that really kind of held Netscape at bay. But if you look at what happened in the long run is Chrome came in and, today Chrome is a platform. You have to be compatible with Chrome. Even Microsoft's Internet Explorer is now based on the Chrome engine, et cetera. It just turned out that the value on the browser didn't really go to the clients. It went to the servers, to these server-based systems like Amazon, Google, et cetera. That's where all the, if you look at Microsoft's still one of the, as you say, one of the most valued companies in the world. If you look at the other most valued companies in the world, Google, Netscape, Meta, et cetera, they're all browser-based companies. So I wish I could go back to get even the judge's name who's in the antitrust trial and say, look,
totally.
Right.
I think, I mean, you had said like you licensed Unix from AT&T, and AT&T's argument was that we'll be irrelevant in 10 years. Turned out to be, so Judge Green, who did the breakup, was totally wrong. Only just that 10 years later, they were completely irrelevant. I think if there was some momentum, they could have delayed it, but not stopped it. Whether it's AT&T or whether it's Microsoft, they couldn't have completely stopped it. But the other question that comes to mind is Microsoft was actually a early investor believer in media. They made a lot of bets in the streaming media cycles at that time. It was unclear. I mean, they obviously it's still called MSNBC. If you think of it, that it goes back to the investment in the NBC era. But were they that much early? Because Netflix, they had everything to be a Netflix, right? But they succeeded in game by Xbox, but not in the Netflix.
Yeah. Now you're going to hear.
Yeah.
So now you're going to hear, my theory as well, which I've told, by the way, to Bill Gates directly. The problem fundamentally was, every company has a. I was going to use the word soul, but it's not the right word. Yeah, every company has an innate understanding and capability, and ours was about the white collar worker and the enterprise. We didn't have a consumer bone in our bodies, in my opinion. We just didn't understand that space. Bill Gates, with all his genius, didn't understand that space. I mean, I can remember the days when there was a big internal debate about whether search was a valuable asset or not. The conclusion was no, search is just going to be a commodity that's given away with the browser. No point in investing in that. We shouldn't go and buy Yahoo or anybody else. Microsoft's had numerous forays to get into the consumer space, none of which have been super successful. In fact, most have been the opposite. And it's because every company, instinctively, the senior management understands that space, and you recruit people who have a similar view, and you know how to distinguish between A quality people and B quality people in that space. In the consumer space, I personally would have had no way to decide whether somebody's an A quality person or a B quality person or a C quality person. I mean, that whole space to me was a mystery, and to I think a lot of other people, it was a mystery as well. So Microsoft has made the reason that it's the asset it is today is because of its white collar enterprise assets, and now it has an opportunity to further those assets through artificial intelligence, and we'll see how that plays out.
Right. So
But in the consumer
one last
space,
in
who
that,
knows what
right?
plays there.
So there's this famous investment that Microsoft and Bill Gates made into Apple that helped it, just be a company. Otherwise, they were going to fold, or at least the folklore says that they would have folded. But uh, for the sake of history, looks like that was a very pivotal, important investment that was made. And theoretically,
I was there and as part of those deliberations, and as important as the investment was, there was another aspect to that deal because the deal I think had three components to it, if I remember rightly here. One was the investment. One was that Apple would switch to use Internet Explorer. People have forgotten that. And thirdly, that the Microsoft Applications Group would continue to develop applications for the Mac platform. At that time, this was in the interregnum between the two reigns of Steve Jobs, and they were really on the ropes. And the Microsoft Applications Group actually said, "Look, it's no longer worth us putting effort into markets, developing and marketing apps for the Mac. It's going down the tubes. We should take all our resources and put them elsewhere." But at that time, we were in the midst of the browser wars, and we desperately wanted, allies in that space. So we went and essentially bought allies in the form of a commitment from Apple to use Internet Explorer, and in return for money and a commitment to continue to develop apps for the Mac platform. And I've no doubt that, in my opinion, that it was that commitment to continuing apps on the Mac platform that enabled the Mac to survive, and Apple to survive for that matter. I'll never forget, I was sent down as the Microsoft representative to announce all of that at the Apple Developer Conference, and I found out that the other person that they'd invited two other people to the event, and one was Muhammad Ali, who was clearly doddering and suffering from Parkinson's or whatever he suffered from. And I remember thinking to myself, why would you want to put this guy up on the stage, sort of the epitome of sort of the aging, doddering champ? It's not the image that I would want to be portraying if I was Apple at that point in time.
So, but do you, the question I was going to sort of extend that on is, do you think that led to when iPhone came out, the App Store also came out? So there was this switch in Steve Jobs' mind that other ecosystem players were necessary to build out his hardware business, because till then they were what they were. I mean, without debating whether the strategy was right or wrong.
Yeah, it was always, strangely enough, a point of, I think, an annoyance with Microsoft and with Bill in particular, that Steve Jobs didn't value more the contribution that Microsoft applications made to the success of the Mac platform. People forget that in 1986, Apple sued Microsoft over the graphical user interface. They claimed that they had they invented that, and anyone who did a graphical user interface was infringing, and we had to go to court over it, and they lost. There was the famous quote that Bill Gates gave in the court, in the deposition, I think, where he said that he and Steve Jobs were like two robbers who'd broken into Xerox's house and were now arguing about the TV on the driveway. But Apple was always very litigious, and I don't think Steve ever appreciated Microsoft's contribution. But yes, when he realized that he was going to do the iPhone, he realized that he needed third parties, but equally, I think he realized that it was a revenue source. People forget that from day one, to be in, the only way you could get an app onto the iPhone was through the App Store, and you had to pay 20% or whatever it is of your revenues over to Apple. So I think he realized that, wow, he took the gamble that he had a really great world-beating product, and that he was in the driver's seat. He could dictate terms, to others. Because look, at that point there were alternatives that were completely open, Android, etc. You didn't have to pay a royalty to be on it. So on the one hand, he was open, but the other hand, he realized
that's right. I mean,
this is my opportunity.
It certainly combined Apple and Steve Jobs' ability to design beautiful products with this, what I would call a very savvy business model that the product itself may not produce recurring.
Yeah, no, it turned out to be a gold mine for them, but it took a lot of chutzpah to do that, and partly because I think he, as I said, I think he always kind of resented Microsoft's making a lot of money off quote unquote his platform. He always thought that he had created the platform and he deserved a cut of everything.
Reflecting back, Paul, the journey that you started in Southern Africa, all the way to today in Microsoft, where AI is prevalent in everybody's life. At the time when you started, you had to leave so that you can actually experience what you had learned. But today, the spread of AI is instant, meaning I would argue all 7+ billion humans have experienced AI in some format, whether they knowingly or unknowingly, etc. The cycles for dissemination has dramatically changed in your lifetime, which you have referred to saying it will never change. In your lifetime from Southern Africa to today, the idea that you could go to your old neighborhood in Southern Africa where you were growing up, and they would have heard of ChatGPT, while at the time you were the first or maybe a few graduates who had heard of computer science. How do you see that journey in your lifetime, given that you have been part of major transformations in lives of humans through this association with Intel and Microsoft?
Well, first of all, it's an experience that I think I share with you two gentlemen. In that, I also came from sort of the fringes of the high tech world, and when I was growing up, you had to physically move yourself to get to where things were really happening, and it's something I share in common with a lot of my colleagues who I've worked with over the years from South Asia, who I think had a similar experience, maybe a little before your two guys' time, but certainly there was a feeling that you had to go to Western Europe or the US in particular to be where it was all happening. That's no longer necessarily the case, as you point out, and there's thanks largely to the internet and other revolutions, information spreads so much more quickly and so much more easily now. And so there's been a massive change in the 50 years that I've been cognizant of the computer world. And I think the next 50 years are going to be even greater change, not necessarily because of computer hardware per se, but because of these twin revolutions that are occurring. One is, the AI revolution, and the other is the biological revolution. For the first time in human history, we're going to have the ability to start manipulating our own DNA, and AI will help us understand how to do that even more quickly. And when those two flywheels start working together, I don't know where this all goes. I think the world's in for a lot of dislocation over the next 10 years. The number of jobs, people are very Pollyanna-ish, I think, in terms of the impact on employment that the AI is going to have. But, here in the US, we have 1 million people who drive trucks. In the next 10 years, that's all going to go away. And I don't think you can just wave your hands and say, no, well, we'll find new things. Well, maybe they can all go into elderly care. I don't know, but it's not going to be an easy transition.
Yeah.
But, one has to. It's
totally fascinating because that resonates with me the most, because I just returned from a trip to India, and when I left nearly 40 years ago, probably 10 to 15 households would share a telephone. I mean, when I meant a telephone as a telephone. Now individuals carry 2 to 3, phone lines or devices even to be connected to the world, right? In a 40-year span, I never thought that they would move from 1 for 10 households or 15 households to every person having 2 devices, irrespective of socioeconomic strata or what they did for a living or what their education. None mattered. Everybody had multiple devices, whether you were interacting with just the shopkeeper where you bought a drink from, or you were in an executive office. Both had similar devices too, not even different devices, like very similar devices. But it is interesting that the 20-year-olds everywhere are looking at from a lens that's dramatically different than the lens I've even experienced thus far. I can't even see that that's the lens they're looking at. Their lens is so normal because their amount of access they have is incredible. So totally relate to it. Paul, this was a incredible conversation from talking to you.
Well, before we go, I just want to add one thing. 20, 25 years ago, I was in India and I had occasion to meet a gentleman whose name unfortunately just escapes my mind. This is the problem of being 70 years old now. But he was
Abdul
attributed to
Kalam.
being one of the fathers of India's atomic bomb effort.
He was the president.
And he
Yeah.
told no,
President
it wasn't him. It was the guy who did the computing side of it, who put the computers together to do all the calculations, etc. But he told the story of how he came from, I think, Bihar State, and he got a scholarship to go to the University of Chicago in the 1960s. And when he said, as a master's student, and when he got to the University of Chicago, he was doing physics master's degree. He had never used a telephone in his life. The first time ever, that's when he got to use a telephone. But the amazing thing is, he said, I found that I was at no disadvantage to my fellow students, that the education he'd received in India stood him in good stead, that he was able to drop right in amongst the sharks and start swimming. I don't know about you guys, but I found the same thing, that for whatever reason, the education that I received meant when I came here to the US, I didn't feel inferior. I was able to adapt very rapidly. And so I think it's important to always remember it's not just about the technology, it's about that foundation, that educational foundation that you get, or you've been lucky enough to get, that is really important. And hopefully that will continue.
Excellent. Yeah. Thank you so much, Paul, for sharing your journey.
Okay.
It's just been
Fun.
incredible.
Good talking to you guys. And I'm going to stay on now until you tell me to get off, okay?
Okay. Thank you.
Thank you for listening to our podcast from Startup to Exit, brought to you by TI Seattle. Assisting in production today are Eesha, Jain, and Minee Verma. Please subscribe to our podcast and rate our podcast wherever you listen to them. Hope you enjoyed it.